My name is Tzvi Sherman, and I will be demonstrating how I've implemented Wwise's diverse tools into Unity's 3D Game Kit asset package. Beginning with ambiences, I created objects that contain distinct colliders for each area of the level, so that there are discrete reverb zones via game-defined auxiliary sends. These zones are also used to control the ambiences via states. Different loops are either lowered and subsequently moved to virtual voices, or they're raised to introduce new sounds. When going from busier areas to more quiet regions, I created custom transition times to account for the amount of changes occurring as the player moves from one area to another. Ambiences are played without 3D positioning so that they remain consistent throughout the level, whereas individualized elements, like these acid pools, utilize the same looping assets with the AkAmbient multi-positioning mode. These regions are connected via AK portals to subtly blend the different reverbs as the player shifts location. In order to add a sense of in-game entities without needing to rely on code or game objects, like the previously mentioned acid pools, I added randomized swamp animals interspersed within the ambiences. Within a looping random container, with randomized volume and pitch offsets, I placed these altered frogs and birds, because they're not exactly the same, we're on an alien planet, with long initial delays, so that the sounds will play at disparate times and the player won't pick up on any repetition. Furthermore, these details are placed within the game world, with 3D positioning around the listener. Paths and placements around the player's listener are chosen at random to give the sense of both variety and immersion. As the player turns the camera, the sound travels with them, so it appears to come from a specific location within the game. Moving on to Ellen, our protagonist, I enlisted the help of my wife for attacks, grunts, and jump vocalizations. The footsteps we recorded outdoors on muddy grass, gravel, concrete, and a variety of other surfaces. I wrote a script for detecting the tag of the surface underneath the player, which then controls a switch group in Wwise for playing the correct material type, with a sequence container to separate heel-toe, with each element having randomized value and pitch to have maximum variation. To ensure sync, footsteps, scuffs, and Foley sounds like cloth were called with animation events, tied to specific frames within various animations. For sounds that the player is hearing frequently, like footsteps, I split the sounds into their constituent parts, and instead of having a single audio file play, I layered the elements into a single play event in Wwise. This enabled me to keep certain aspects consistent, like Ellen's weapon swing combos growing in intensity and pitch, while still being able to randomize the pitch and volume for each individual component. That way, no two swings are exactly alike, but each combo is still increasing in energy. For the enemies Ellen encounters, I wanted them to constantly be emitting some kind of sound, so they felt real and had presence. For instance, the chomper enemies have an idle loop of them growling. Although the loop is reused for each instance of a chomper, so that I could save on assets, not only are the pitch and volume parameters randomized, but I use the seek function within Wwise to further randomize where the loop begins, so each chomper sounds unique. Once a chomper begins chasing Ellen, the idle loop is replaced with a chase loop that has heavier breathing and angry growls, so that the player always knows where the enemy is and so that the chomper is more dynamic. Upon death, all the loops are stopped in Wwise, and the chomper evaporates. The grenade golem is the level's big boss, so I wanted all elements of this enemy to convey a sense of danger to the player, as his hits pack a punch. I recorded myself, performing various vocal emotes so the player has an audible cue for an incoming attack, as well as feedback for landing a successful hit. I split the numerous pieces of the robot's attacks between animation event calls within Unity and hard-coded functions. This enabled me to separate details in a 3D space, like the grenade's charge taking place above the player, while the launch happens from the golem's body at a slightly lower plane. This also allowed for flexibility between events should the player pause or interrupt the boss with a direct hit. So instead of playing through a single audio file tied to the animation event, the separate audio calls could be interrupted and actually never get called in the first place. Wise's cone attenuation was integral to hinting to the player that they need to be behind the golem in order to successfully damage its engine. The engine loop is occluded from the front and gains clarity as the player circles around the enemy, indicating that this is something to pay attention to. As the player lands successive hits, I used a blend container in Wwise tied to an RTPC of the golem's health to progressively make the engine sound more affected as the golem is closer to death. This expresses to the player how close they are to winning and encourages them to continue their winning strategy of wailing on the engine, as it's clearly having a desired effect. Finally, I crafted custom attenuation sets for the different parts of the golem, including its numerous attacks, like the ranged grenade, as well as its footsteps, so that when the player is farther away, there's directionality to the sound, so the player can easily locate the boss, while the spread in Wwise moves to a more stereo image if the player is close enough. That way they know how close they are to danger. For the assorted other components in the level, I shared attenuation sets for similar items where applicable, but didn't shy away from making individualized attenuations when things just didn't sound right, availing myself of diverse output bus volumes, low pass curves, spread amounts, and aux sends, so that the farther away from a sound source the player gets, the more the environment affects the signal. For example, there's one point where the player opens up a door leading to a switch that they must activate, but once the camera cuts back to them, they may have missed where the door actually is located. I created an attenuation that becomes directional the moment the listener is snapped back to the Ellen player model. This way, there's an auditory clue as to where the door is situated. As the player reaches the final area of the level, a looming teleporter stands before them, and using an RTPC, based on the distance to Ellen, the player is suggestively drawn forward by the evolving sonic facets within a blend container, thus matching the visual effects. Other fun uses I found for RTPCs were implementing a low-pass filter when the player is in the menu to express that the level is paused around them. This only affects sounds passing through the world bus, however, while UI elements going through a separate bus remain untouched and play clearly. Tying an RTPC to Unity's slider component allowed me to hand over control to the player to globally adjust the value of Wise's master bus and put the volume of the game where they're comfortable listening. Thank you for watching through to the end. I hope this video clearly demonstrated how I've employed some of the tools Wwise has to offer, like random, blend, and sequence containers, switches, states, and RTPCs, as well as attenuation sharesets and more complex 3D positioning. If you'd like to play through my demonstration level yourself, it's available through my portfolio page, located here.